Christopher Allen Denyor was born on December 26, 1967, to his mom Dale and dad Mike in California. But when he was a child, his parents divorced, and him and his sister Cherry stayed with their mom. But by the time Chris was in his teens, both his parents had remarried. His mom married Jackson Villarta, who had a child of his own, and then the family moved to Salinas, California, and Jackson and Dale added 2 other children to the family. Salinas, California, which is Spanish for salt marsh, is the birthplace of writer John Steinbeck, a population of about 165,000 people, with about 75% of its residents being Hispanic. Chris grew into a rather strapping young lad at 5'10" and almost 200 pounds, so joining the North Salinas High School football team seemed fairly natural for him. He was a very good-looking young man and had a girlfriend named Carlotta, and although things were going very well for him scholastically and socially, at home he was a little less happy and wasn't a big fan of the rules that his mom and stepdad had put on him. So in January of 1984, just after his 17th birthday, he left home to pursue a football career, hoping to play professionally. Dale, his mom, was rather distraught over his leaving. In January 1998, Eric and Diana Carball, who's a young couple living in Salinas on Navajo Drive, had been living in their house for about 2 years when they decided to expand the heating ducts in their 5-bedroom, 2,200 square foot home to accommodate the upgraded HVAC system that they'd purchased. Eric took the trapdoor to the kitchen floor off to get to the crawl space, and the opening was located in the kitchen's pantry. The space below was cramped and dark, really only maybe 2 feet between the dirt on the ground and the floor joists. So he took his flashlight and crawled in to inspect the ducts. Only once he was down there, he noticed a white tennis shoe sticking out of the dirt, which wouldn't have been so unnerving if it had been sitting there like a normal discarded shoe. But this one was resting on its heels like someone was wearing it while laying down. So a bit freaked out, he backed out of the crawl space, and his sister-in-law was visiting at the time. So Eric told Diana and his sister about it, and together they kind of discussed it like maybe it was one of those pranks that some homeowners will do to new buyers, like burying a toy skeleton in the basement or something. It could be that the shoe was just tossed down there and for some reason it just landed funny. But Eric was too big to really adventure around down there, so Diana's sister said that she'd go down and check it out. Brave woman. She took a flashlight and scrambled back up seconds later, reporting that the shoe had a sock in it and that the sock was attached to what she was pretty sure was a human leg bone. So they called the Salinas Police Department, who was also pretty sure that this was just some kind of dumb prank. Certainly nothing to be too concerned over. But you got to humor people, so they actually cut a large opening into the kitchen floor, and sure enough, there was a skeletal remains of a man, complete with a bullet that had been dropped into the dirt as the man had decomposed. Cause of death of the man was 3 bullets, 2 to the head and 1 possibly in the back, all from close range. The remains were sent to an anthropologist to try and get an identity. And because of where the body was hidden, it was clearly personal, and the man had to have known his killer. So chances are, they surmised, whoever had killed this man had lived in this house at one time. And the previous owners told them that Dale had told them when they purchased the house in 1989 that if a man matching her son Chris's description ever knocked on the door, to let her know, because she was still hopeful that Chris would one day want to come home. They also tracked down the missing persons report that Dale had reported back in 1984, and the man's remains were identified as belonging to Chris Denyor, who was still only 17 years old, so he had not, in fact, run away from home. First, they tracked down Carlotta, Chris's girlfriend. She said that she had been dating Chris for about a year when he disappeared. She hadn't really believed that Chris ran away because she was sure he would have said goodbye to her at least. But murder hadn't crossed her mind either. She said that Chris had complained a lot about Jackson and his mom and the rules, mostly Jackson. She told detectives that Jackson was always on him about something or other and kind of just made life at home miserable for Chris. He treated his own kids differently than his stepkids, and his mom just let him make all the rules. Then she relayed a story about one of the last times that she'd seen Chris. He had come to her with tears in his eyes over his dog that had gotten very sick, and he suspected that Jackson had poisoned the dog just because Chris was rebelling against his rules. Dale and Jackson now being their prime suspects in Chris's murder, they don't want to tip them off just yet about their discovery. So instead, they determine that Chris's sister had moved to Iowa, and they start by notifying her of Chris's death and see what they can learn. Chris has been positively identified from dental records, which showed a retainer placed and bonded in his teeth. It was also determined that he had died at the time that he went missing, as his wisdom teeth had not grown any further from the time his last dental x-rays had been done. Cherry, although surprised and grief-stricken to learn about her brother's fate, she had a feeling all those years ago that something wasn't right about Chris's leaving home. On that evening, Jackson called Dale and told her that Chris was late getting home. She came home and found that his room looked exactly the same. All his clothes were there, all the family's suitcases were still there, but Carlotta had come to tell him that Chris had missed their date and never called her anything. So Dale called Chris's best friend, Rob Pruitt, who admitted to Dale and Cherry that Chris had mentioned that he wasn't happy at home and was considering running away. But it was strange that he hadn't shared any specific plans and hadn't included Carlotta in these plans because they were deeply in love with each other. Chris had sometimes blown off steam by going out to his dad's place, but he'd never been able to stay there for very long because his dad's house was kind of the opposite of his mom's, with too few rules, and his grades started to slip and he always had to come back home. Now, sometimes he would go and stay with his grandma as well, who was always supportive and sympathetic towards him, but neither had seen or heard from him. Dale reported Chris missing to the police, but upon hearing how he might have run away, they told her not to worry, he's going to show up. Cherry told police that about 3 days after Chris disappeared, they received a telegram from him. Cherry was always very suspicious of the telegram. I mean, what teenager even knows how to send one? It read, "Mom, I'm fine. I'm on my way to Newport Beach. I couldn't stay there anymore, and I'm sorry I had to leave. I wish I could continue to go to school there, but other circumstances came up. Jack was right. In some ways, I'm sorry for being rude to you. Please take care of things. I will either come home for them or send for them. Later, Chris. P.S. I'll see you when I'm in the NFL." Now, this telegram didn't really sit well with Dale or Cherry. It was strange in a few ways. Chris hadn't even decided if he was going to play football in his senior year. He'd never once mentioned any dreams of playing professional football. And Cherry had read the telegram to her stepmom, Velma, her dad's second wife, and she said, no, that's not Chris. He wasn't interested in being a professional football player. And the way the telegram was phrased didn't feel right. Chris long had issues with his stepdad, Jackson, so apologizing and saying Jackson was right wasn't something that sounded right at all. But the detectives still had a question that they couldn't seem to get their brains wrapped around. How had she lived in that house all that time with Chris's body under the kitchen floor? The smell must have been a dead giveaway. Pardon the pun. Chris's body hadn't actually been buried very deep at all, and it wasn't wrapped in anything. But she said that she had remembered noticing a smell, but Dale and Jackson reminded her of the pet snake that they once had gotten loose, which is something I shudder to think of, and it must have slithered into some ducks or something and died. Dale did provide the police at the time with the telegram, letting them know that she didn't feel right about it, but they figured he was definitely a runaway because he was close to 18, and they closed the file. Dale never gave up hope that one day her son was going to come home or at least be found. She put up posters all over the area and scanned the faces of whoever she went by for Chris's features. But all that came crashing down on her in 1998 when she was finally told the truth about where Chris had been all this time. But investigators were still very suspicious of Dale's involvement in her son's death, so they brought her in to notify her of Chris's death and ask a few questions. Detective Bob Eggers told the Oxygen Network, "I know how foul the human body is when it decomposes. You will never forget it. It is so overpowering that the snake story made no sense." That told us that, yeah, they were living there and they knew something was amiss. Now, I have said before, and I'm going to say again, not smelling death is hardly something to get convicted over. It can be passed off as rotting meat or garbage. And have you ever walked into your house and thought, oh my God, what died in here, only to discover that you accidentally pulled the chicken breasts out to thaw and left them on the lid of the freezer? Or is that just me? Anyways, Dale was very upset to learn about her son's death because she always believed he was alive somewhere. Her story matched with Cherry's exactly, so it was time to look at Jackson. She said that she had been at work on the day Chris disappeared, and Jackson phoned her and told her that he had run away. They asked her if anyone in the house had access to a gun, and she said that Jackson had a gun, but she had no idea what kind it was. It was for home security. It also turns out that at the time of Chris's murder, Dale was heavily pregnant, so it was unlikely that Dale knew anything about what had actually happened to Chris. Dale had filed for divorce from Jackson just after this fourth child of hers, a baby girl, was born. Jackson worked for a phone company, so they tracked him down while on his route at work and asked him to come in for questioning. He was cooperative and had no issue with coming in to discuss his stepson's missing person case. They didn't tell him that they had actually found him at that point. Jackson told detectives that he had the usual teenage arguments with Chris, nothing too out of the ordinary, just the usual things dads and sons argue about, the cleanliness of his room, his homework, curfew, etc. He said that he had been at work on the day that Chris left. He worked from noon until 8 p.m. and then he came home. Dale told him that Chris had run away. But that's not what Dale said at all. He admitted that he owned two guns, a .22 caliber and a .38 caliber revolver. Chris had been killed with a .38 caliber, so they wanted a search warrant for that and had to get it quick before Jackson disposed of it. And they asked him if he could think of any reason why Chris would be found shot under the kitchen if he had run away. He was pretty calm about the whole thing and just said, nope, he ran away and we got a telegraph from him. You didn't notice any smell from the kitchen? Nope, not at all. No dead snake smell? Nope, nada. What if we told you that we think you killed Chris and put him under the crawl space? Nope, hurt me. So detectives got their search warrant and got to Jackson's house before he could get there and found a couple of interesting things. It turns out the family were kind of hoarders when it came to paperwork. They had everything from phone bills to tax returns and receipts from back like 10 years ago. And in these records, they found a receipt for a telegram from January of 1998 after Chris had been murdered, and it was charged to the family's phone bill and purchased or ordered by Jackson. They also found the .38 revolver and its bullets, which ballistics matched the lands and grooves to the bullet found in Chris's body. Jackson Villarta was arrested on February 6, 1999 for Chris Denoyer's murder. The theory of the investigators and prosecution was that Jackson had gotten into a verbal argument with Chris, where Chris accused Jackson of poisoning his dog, while Dale was at work and the other kids were at school. Knowing that Chris, at 5'10", wasn't going to leave the 5'5" Jackson with much of a chance in a physical fight, he got his gun and shot him in the back and then in the head. Then removed the trapdoor in the kitchen floor and dragged him down there, made up the story about running away and the telegram to throw everyone off track, and then went about his business of consoling Dale on Chris's abandonment of the family like nothing had happened. There had been no financial gain for Jackson by killing Chris other than one less mouth to feed for maybe the one more year that he would have been living under his roof. It was simply because Chris had annoyed him one too many times by being a normal 17-year-old boy. The prosecution contended that there was no way that an intruder would have come in and shot Chris only to take the time to bury him under the crawl space. Jackson was the only person in the home that was both strong enough to drag Chris's body, but also fit under the crawl space to do some digging. Jackson was booked and held on $1 million bail. Jackson's current neighbors were shocked and disbelieving that the gentle and loving parent that they thought Jackson was, or at least portrayed himself to be, could have done such a horrific thing to his own stepson, and that it could have gone undiscovered for 15 years. Chris's grandmother, who had always supported him, said that she was just heartbroken and that the problem had always been that Jackson didn't like Chris only because he wasn't his child and simply because he didn't want him around anymore. There's no way he would have left without ever contacting me or his sister. She always knew that something was not right about it. The evidence against Jackson was pretty substantial and should have been an easy open and shut case. Witnesses testified about the hours Dale spent searching for her son and how Jackson complained about all the time that she was wasting on it and not spending with him. There was also testimony from family that Jackson had burned some documents when he learned that Chris's body had been discovered. The defense could only argue that Chris had started running with a very bad crowd and one of his associates had killed him, and that he had in fact run away and then came back when no one was home, bringing with him one of these unfavorable thug friends of his. And believe it or not, this first trial ended in a hung jury, with them not being able to come to a unanimous decision, ending with a 9 to convict and 3 to acquit. It was rumored that one of the juries wanting to acquit refused to convict him, not because she thought Jackson was innocent, but because she worked at a prison and knew what life was like for convicts there and couldn't bear the thought of sending anyone there. At his second trial in May of 2000, he was finally convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 17 years to life. 2 years were added to the sentence for using a gun. The prosecutor was happy with the sentence, although he had originally hoped for first degree, but knew it would be too hard to prove that it was deliberate and planned after all these years had gone by. Chris's remaining family was very relieved at the sentence, that it was finally over after 15 years of searching, wondering, worrying, and wishing. He appealed the decision based on the testimony about him poisoning the dog shouldn't have been allowed, and the videotape reenactment of a person his size in the crawl space digging a grave should also not have been allowed. He was denied on the grounds that there was sufficient evidence that he had in fact poisoned the dog, and the videotape was deemed relevant. He tried for parole in 2009. He was denied. He became eligible again in 2021. There is no word on his current whereabouts. As far as I know, he is still at Solano State Prison in Vacaville, California. And that was the murder of Chris Denyor. I hope you will join me again in a couple weeks for another exclusive episode. As always, thank you so much for listening.